Hey, Bio30. So we're going to continue our discussion about the reproductive system by talking about the female reproductive system. So this first video is going to be about structures, and then we'll move on to other portions of the reproductive system. So we'll just go through some structures here initially. So we've got the ovary. We'll talk about each of these in detail in a moment. These little hair-like projections, finger-like projections called fimbriae. The fallopian tube. The fallopian tube, also known as the oviduct, depending on what textbook you're looking at. The uterus, the cervix, so the cervical opening of the uterus. The vagina, the ureter, part of the urinary tract. The bladder, the urethra, and the clitoris. There's two labia, the minora and the majora. Oops, and then we're going to just talk about each of these, some in more detail than others right away here. So moving forward here, we've got the front section, sort of a cross section here of the female reproductive system. We'll go through some similar structures as on the last slide. We've got the ovary. The ovary is the site of oogenesis, which is kind of like spermatogenesis. It's that meiosis event, that reduction division going from 2N diploid body cells, somatic cells, to haploid single N sex cells, or in this case, eggs in women. Estrogen and progesterone are going to be released from the ovaries as well. Got those fimbriae, which are designed to they're finger-like projections, and they're going to grab the egg when it's released by the ovary, and they're going to toss them into this long tube called the fallopian tube. Now, the fallopian tube is usually the site of fertilization, so a sperm will work its way up the cervix through the vaginal opening and find its way eventually into the fallopian tube, where if it's lucky, or a dozen sperm or so are lucky, one of them will actually enter the egg itself and implant. Without that happening, you won't have implantation. And so the fallopian tube is usually the site of fertilization. The endometrium is the one of the layers of the uterus wall, or the lining of the uterus wall. The uterus itself is usually the site of implantation. So fertilization, sperm actually entering the egg, is going to typically happen in the fallopian tube. But then that fertilized egg, if successfully fertilized, is going to now travel to the uterus and implant on the wall of the uterus. The cervix is the opening of the uterus, and the vagina is the birth canal. Okay, so the ovaries themselves, we'll go into a bit more detail here. These are the site of oogenesis. So females have two ovaries, and they alternate each month to produce an egg, or an ovum, is the fancy name, and that's called oogenesis, or this is the process of meiosis in women. So the follicles are going to be the egg, and they're the female gamete, and they secrete estrogen. And then there's another sort of partial section of cells called the corpus luteum, and they secrete hormones called estrogen and progesterone. So your ovaries contain about 400,000 egg cells, but only about 400 are actually going to mature in a reproductive life of around ages 12 to 50. And so although you have 400,000 egg cells, only about 400 will actually mature into ovum, which are able to be fertilized. So the egg is significantly larger than the sperm cell because the cytoplasm in the egg has to provide enough nutrients for 5 days of sustainable nutrient administration if the egg is fertilized. So the sperm is quite small in comparison to the egg as a whole. The ovum is going to live for about 24 hours after ovulation, and if it's fertilized, then other hormones and nutrients will kick in to keep it going for the 5 days until it's implanted. And if it's not fertilized, then the egg will die after about 24 hours. So the window for a successful pregnancy is kind of narrow, biologically speaking. And so ovulation is when a follicle matures. It's then going to rupture, and it's going to release that ovum. The fimbriae is going to pick up the ovum from the ovary. Those are those finger-like projections we talked about, and they're going to kind of toss them down the fallopian tube. In the fallopian tube, this is where usually a successful fertilization event will happen. The sperm will find the egg here in the fallopian tube, either on the left or on the right, and it fertilization will occur. The uterus is going to be made up of the endometrium, which is the nourishing layer of the uterus, which is going to nourish the embryo during implantation after successful fertilization. It's also the layer that's shed during menstruation. So it's really rich in blood vessels and really rich in thick cellular membranes, and it's what's going to slough off during a menstrual flow. The myometrium is in the middle, and it's the muscular layer that's going to provide contractions for childbirth, as well as during the female orgasm. And then the cervix is the muscular opening to the uterus itself, and its cells are constantly shed and replaced as well. This is a Pap smear. So we've got a diagram here of a very invasive looking instrument, which is going to be checking for changes in the cells of the cervix itself. And so changes may indicate an infection, cervical cancer cells, which, by the way, cervical cancers can be caused by a lot of HPV infections or genital warts, pardon me. And so a Pap smear is done by basically checking the surface cells of the cervix and testing them. The vagina itself is the entrance for the penis, but as well as the birth canal. And then during fertilization and implantation, the pathway for sperm will be as follows. So sperm will enter the vagina, go through the cervix or the cervical opening, enter the uterus, through the fallopian tube, where fertilization will usually occur, like we've said a couple times in the video so far. And implantation is going to occur then in the uterus when that fertilized egg is going to move down the fallopian tube and implant somewhere in the endometrium of the uterus. Just like for the last video where we talked about male hormones, we're going to talk about hormones in females as well. So puberty in girls is going to be like we previously spoke about for puberty in boys. The hypothalamus is going to release a hormone called gonadotropin-releasing hormone, GnRH. And GnRH is going to activate the anterior pituitary to release follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH. Follicle-stimulating hormone secretions are carried by the blood to the ovary, where follicle development is stimulated. And then the follicles within the ovary are going to secrete estrogen into the blood, which stimulates the development of secondary female characteristics like breast development, hair development, and the bone structure. The menstrual cycle is a very intricate interaction of many hormones in the female endocrine system, and I will split this into another video. So in the next video, we'll talk about the menstrual cycle as a whole. Thanks, guys. Bye.